Hello everyone. So continuing our deep learning series, in this video we're going to go over the section which corresponds to a simple network which can classify handwritten digits. So having defined neural networks which we've done, let's turn to handwriting recognition. We can split the problem of recognizing handwritten digits into two subproblems. Okay. First we'd like a way of breaking an image containing many digits into a sequence of separate images, each containing a separate digit. For example, if we have such an uh, uh, okay, so if we have such digits, then we'd like to separate them into six individual digits. We humans solve this segmentation problem with ease, but it's challenging for a computer program to break up the image. Once the image has been segmented, the program then needs to classify each individual digit. So this should be a 5, a 0, a 4, a 1, a 9, and a 2. Okay, so we'll focus on writing a program to solve the second problem, that is classifying individual digits. We do this because it turns out the segmentation problem is not so difficult to solve. Once you have a good way of classifying individual digits, there are many approaches to solving the segmentation problem. One approach is to trial many different ways of segmenting the image using the individual image digit classifier to score each trial segmentation. A trial segmentation gets a high score if the individual digit classifier is confident of its classes in all segments, and a low score if the classifier is having a lot of trouble in one or more segments. The idea is that if the classifier is having trouble somewhere, then it's probably having trouble because the segmentation has been chosen incorrectly. This idea and other variations can be used to solve the segmentation problem quite well. So instead of worrying about segmentation, we'll concentrate on developing a neural network which can solve the more interesting and difficult problem, namely recognizing individual handwritten digits. Okay, so essentially they've said that if you have a number in this form, there are two tasks at hand. So rather than identifying all of them at once, you would rather break them into their individual digits and then identify them. Okay, so in this way, the computer can pick up on individual digits rather than having to look for the entire number at once. So the segmentation problem, which they refer to, they won't be going into in depth about that problem. Rather, they are going to focus on classifying the digits from the images. So we'll also focus on that only. Okay, so to recognize individual digits, we will use a three-layer neural network. Okay, so in their input, they have 784 neurons. They have 784 neurons because these images are 28 by 28 pixel. So there are a total of 784 pixels, and uh, they've not like drawn everything because that would be too extreme. So the input pixels are grayscale with a value of 0.0 point 0 representing white and a value of 1.0 representing black, and in between the shades of gray. Okay, the second layer of the network is a hidden layer. Yep, and we denote this hidden layer by the number of neurons by n, and we'll experiment with different values of n. So to start off, they're using 15 neurons. The output layer of the network contains 10 neurons. If the first neuron fires, that is has an output equivalent to 1, then then it will indicate that the network thinks that the digit is a 0. So if this one has fires, then the network thinks it's a 0. If this one fires, then it's a 1, and so on. Okay, so a little more precisely, we number the output neurons from 0 to 9, and whichever neuron has the highest activation value, we say that that neuron is firing, and the model is predicting that that is the most likely outcome. So for instance, if in a case the model is confused between two digits, you might see the model saying like 60% probability for digit 4 and a 30% probability for a digit 3, and so on. You might wonder why we use 10 output neurons. After all, the goal of the network is to tell us which digit is in the output. A seemingly natural way is to use just 4 output neurons, treating each neuron as a binary value, and you can represent up to 16 numbers. So why should we use 10 neurons instead? Isn't that inefficient? Yeah. The ultimate justification is empirical. We can try out both network designs, and it turns out for a particular problem, the network with 10 output neurons learns to recognize digits better than the network with 4 output neurons. But that leaves us wondering why using 10 output neuron works better. Is there some heuristic that would tell us in advance that we should use 10 output encoding instead of 4 output encoding? Okay, these are all valid questions. So essentially, if you're not if you didn't grasp what they are trying to convey here, how they are trying to use four neurons, so with by if you're familiar with the binary system, they're trying to say instead of taking decimal digits corresponding to each neuron, why not take the binary number represented by the neurons as the digit they are trying to outcome, right? So when you have four neurons, they can all either be a 1 or a 0, so each of them have two possible outcomes. So in all they can form the first 16 number whole numbers, or 0 to 15 namely. So 16 whole numbers begin with 0, and the first 16 whole numbers begin at 0 and end at 15. So to understand why we do this, it helps us to think about what the neural networks is doing from principle. So consider the first case where we use 10 output neurons. Let's concentrate on the first output neuron, the one that's trying to decide whether or not the digit is a 0. It does this by weighing up the evidence from the hidden layer of the neurons. This makes sense. So what are the hidden neurons doing? Well, just suppose for the sake of argument that the first neuron in the hidden layer is detecting whether or not an image like the following is present. Okay, it can do this by heavily weighting input pixels which overlap with the image and only lightly sensing the other inputs. Yeah, so what they're trying to say, they will put this filter over each image, and if the image uh, has the same design, then it will give a high signal, but if it has a very different design, then it will give a low signal. In a similar way, let's, for the sake of argument, assume that the second, third, and fourth neurons are looking for these things. So, as you may have guessed, the four images together come together to make a zero. So, all those four hidden neurons are firing and conclude that the digit is a zero. Of course, that's not the only sort of evidence we can use to conclude that the image was a zero. We could legitimately get a zero in many other ways. So, say through translations of the above images or slight distortions. But it seems safe to say that, at least in this case, we'd conclude that the output was a zero. So they're trying to give you a brief idea of what the hidden layers are doing. Hidden layers, in fact, are looking for specific patterns and the neurons of the hidden layers. So it is not necessary that these are the specific patterns. They totally depend on the training data and how the model is trained. So even though we have the same training data, the model might make different patterns, or different neurons might look for different patterns. Supposing the neural network in this way, we can give a plausible explanation for why it's better to have 10 outputs rather than 4. If we had 4 outputs, then the first output neuron would be trying to decide what the most significant bit of the digit was. And there's no easy way to relate the most significant bit to simple shapes like those shown above. Yeah. It's hard to imagine that there's a good historical reason the component shapes of the digits will be closely related to, say, the most significant bit in the output. Now, with all that said, this is all just a heuristic. Nothing says that the third layer neural network has to operate in the way I described, with the hidden neurons detecting simple component shapes. Maybe a clever learning algorithm will find some assignment of weights that will let us use only four output neurons. But as a heuristic, the way of thinking I've described works pretty well and can save you a lot of time in designing good neural network architectures. So this was quite enriching, I believe, because I have never seen this point being raised in the other tutorials that I have used. So, what they've essentially claimed is, for instance, if you had used that binary one, which seemed a bit more efficient, like you have only four output neurons, then there's no direct correlation between the most significant bit and the patterns. So it won't be that specific patterns relate to specific digits, but as they've also said, that there might be some other learning algorithm which might just effectively use the four output neuron system. So let's have a look at the exercise here. There is a way of determining the bitwise representation of a digit by adding an extra layer to the three-layer network above. The extra layer converts the output from the previous layer into a binary representation. Find a set of weights and biases for the new output layer. Assume that the first three layers are such that the correct output in the activation layer has activation of at least 0.99, and the incorrect ones have this less than this. So indirectly they're trying to say that assume that up until this point you're getting correct outputs. So, and what the simple aim is. So if you get a 0, then all of these should indicate a 0, right? So if you get a 1, then you should get a 1 0 0 0, and if you get a 2, you should get a 0 1 0 0. So if you have this lighting up, but none of these should light up, right? So the weights emitting from uh, this would give an activated signal to all four of them, right? But then the weights come into play. So for all of them to be zero, all the weights have to be zero, right? So I'm assuming this to be the least significant bit and this to be the most significant bit. If you're not comfortable with binary, don't worry at all. This is not like something which you have a look at every day, but this certainly gives you a very good intuition about the output layers. If you're using this, then you can just uh, take this weight to be 1 and the rest to be 0. If this is the output, then this weight, the weight corresponding to this neuron should be 0, then 1, then 0 0. So you get the idea. You get the weights as based on the binary representation. Okay, so now we are at gradient descent. Finally, learning with gradient descent. Now that now that we have a design for a neural network, how can it learn to recognize digits? That's what we're trying to do. The first thing we'll need is a data set to learn from a so-called training data set. We'll use the MNIST or the MNIST dataset. So MNIST dataset is like the most historically famous dataset, one of the most historically famous datasets. You'll even see papers dating to the 90s which have used this dataset, which contains tens of thousands of scanned images of handwritten digits together with their correct classification. MNIST's name comes from the fact that it is a modified subset of two datasets collected by NIST, the United States National Institute of Standards and Technology. So these are all images from the MNIST dataset, and these were so if you if you study more deep learning, these names pop up a lot, especially Lakon 5 is a very famous trained model in a huge paper. So and you can see like these are the papers which have got high efficiency. So you can see papers dating as back to even back to 1998. And even you'll see paper as recent as 2012 even listed here, and there might be even more recent papers which are not updated, I'm not sure. So let's get back. As you can see, these digits are in fact the same as shown as in the beginning of this chapter as a challenge to recognize. Of course, when testing our network, we'll ask it to recognize images which are in the training set. So why do we do this? This is a very important thing to understand. You don't want your model to memorize stuff, right? So if you show the model the same data again and again, again and again, then instead of learning, the model might just memorize. And when you test it on the same data as which you're training it, then you might get incorrect results. Like the just might recognize all 1 million digits if there are 1 million digits. There aren't, I believe, but let's for the sake of argument assume there are 1 million digits and you train it extensively, and the model, instead of looking for patterns, instead memorizes all 1 million digits, and then you test it on the same data set and you get a very good result, like 100% result, then you'll be very happy. But that result is in fact not at all good. First of all, the model hasn't learned, instead it has memorized. And secondly, you're using the same data set to test as well as train. Instead you use different data sets to test as well as train, because say for instance you're preparing for an exam and you look at all the book questions and you memorize all of them, you understand all of them, then you look at previous year exam questions, right? You don't just keep looking at the book questions again and again, again and again. You have to test yourself on testing data, not on training data. Okay. So the MNIST dataset also comes in two parts. The first part contains 60,000 training data images. These images are scanned handwriting samples from 250 people, half of whom were US Census Bureau employees and half of whom were high school students. These images are grayscale and 28 by 28 pixel in size. The second part of the MNIST dataset is 10,000 images used as testing data. Again, these are 28 by 28 grayscale images. We'll use the test data to evaluate how well our neural network has learned to recognize digits. To make this a good test of performance, the test data was taken from a different set of 250 people than the original training data. albeit still a group from between Census Bureau employees and high school students. This gives us confidence that our system can recognize digits from people whose writing it didn't see during training. I hope this makes sense after this example. Just another thing I'd like to point out. These 10,000 images are the same 10,000 images which every researcher uses when they are working with the MNIST dataset, because they have to report their accuracy in the same dataset. Like when you go to the MNIST dataset error page, you see these errors, right? If all of them were reporting on different datasets, then there wouldn't be any sense of comparing them, because it might be like someone got really unlucky and got all the tricky digits in one case, while someone got really lucky and got all the easy ones, so his error is low. So I hope this makes sense now. Okay. So we'll use the notation X to denote a training input. It would be convenient to regard each training input X as a 28 by 28 784 dimensional vector. Each pixel corresponds to entry of a vector. We'll denote the corresponding desired output y of x, where y is a 10-dimensional vector. For example, if a particular image is a 6, then it only the 6 corresponding the position corresponding to the number 6 would have a 1. This is the desired output from the network. Here T is the transpose operation turning a row into a column vector. So essentially, this is nothing but you are seeing it like a row, right? But in actuality, this is a column vector. This, this is a column, which is in fact a vector. Also, what we like is an algorithm which helps us find the weights and biases, and so that the output from the network approximates y of x, which is this, for all the training inputs x. To quantify how we are achieving, we define a cost function, and we'll get into this, but just like have a look at the formula if this makes sense. You and let's have a look at the side note as well. Sometimes referred to as a loss or objective function. We use the term cost function throughout this book, but you should note the other terminology since it's often used in research papers and other discussions of neural networks. So you might find this to be referred to as the objective function sometimes. Okay. So here W denotes the collection of all weights, B all the biases, N is the number of training inputs, A is a vector of output from the network where X is input and sum is over all training inputs X. Of course, the output A depends on X, W in B. Like we've seen this, it is X dot W plus B and then the activation function. But to keep the notation simple, I haven't explicitly indicated the dependence. The notation norm of V just denotes the usual length function for a vector v. So the length of the vector. We'll call C the quadratic cost function. It's also sometimes known as the mean squared error. So why the mean squared error? We're seeing that the square is here. It's also the mean because we have a 1 over n, where n is the size of the data set. And if you're familiar with, like, if you work with errors and even worked in some physics and all, then you've probably seen the mean squared error function. I'll show it to you once. You can see this looks awfully similar to the one we have at hand. Just there is a 2 here, and we'll also get into the 2. The 2 is particularly there because when you differentiate this, these two cancel out. Okay. So inspecting the form of the quadratic cost function, we see that C of WB is non-negative since every term is non-negative. Since you have a square, every term is non-negative. At max, it can be 0. Furthermore, the cost function W of B becomes small when Y of X is approximately equal to the output A for all training inputs. So basically, when the predicted outputs and the actual outputs are closer, your cost function decreases, while when they are far apart, the cost function increases. So our training algorithm has done a good. Did I miss something? Yeah, no. So our training algorithm has done a good job if it can find weights and biases so that this approximates to 0. By contrast, if it is large, that would mean that y of x is not close enough to the output a for a large number of inputs. So the aim of our training algorithm would be to minimize the cost function as a function of weights and biases. In other words, we want to find a set of weights and biases which make the cost as small as possible. And to do this, we'll use an algorithm known as gradient descent. So for the two explanation, once again, since if you are familiar with calculus, you know to find the minima. Since we are trying to minimize this, we often use the derivative of the function. And when you do the derivative of x square, if, or say a square function, you get a 2 as a coefficient, which would be cancelled out. So this is for that particular reason. Okay, so why introduce the quadratic cost? After all, aren't we primarily interested in the number of images correctly classified by the network? Why not try to maximize the number directly rather than minimizing a proxy measure like the quadratic cost? Right. The problem with that is that the number of images correctly classified is not a smooth function of the weights and biases. So the so try to give it a bit more context. If the number predicted number and the actual number are far apart, then it is the fault of the weight and biases, right? But and you can sort of uh, know if I tweak the weights and biases like this, then I'll get a better output or a worse output. However, if you take a look at just all the images and how many of them have been classified correctly, then you won't have like a good objective way of thinking how this relates to the weights and biases. There isn't a direct relationship. So think about it. I highly recommend thinking about it. For the most part, making small changes to the weights and biases won't cause any change at all in the number of training images classified correctly. That makes it difficult to figure out how to change the weight and biases to get improved performance. If we instead use a smooth cost function like the quadratic cost, it turns out to be easy to figure out how to make small changes in the weights and biases so as to get an improvement in the cost. That's why we focus first on minimizing the quadratic cost, and only after that we examine the classification accuracy. So classification accuracy here, I'd like to pause for a second. I'll be back. Okay, so I'm back. Sorry for the delay. Alright, so so I explained the part where I discussed why we minimize the quadratic cost first and then look at the classification accuracy. So even given that we want to use a smooth cost function, you may still wonder why we chose a quadratic function used in equation 6. Isn't this a rather ad hoc choice? Perhaps if we chose a different cost function, we'd get a totally different set of minimizing weights and biases. And this is a very valid concern which we'll revisit later when we revisit the cost function and make modifications. However, the quadratic cost function works perfectly for understanding the basics of neural networks. So recapping, our goal in training a neural network is to find weights and biases which minimize the cost function. This is a well-posed problem, but it's got a distracting structure as currently posed the interpretation of weights and biases and the sigmoid function lurking in the background, the choice of network architecture, index, and so on. It turns out that we can understand a tremendous amount by ignoring most of the structure and just concentrating on the minimization aspect. So for now, we're going to forget all this about the specific form, the cost function, the connection of the neural networks, and so on. And instead, we're going to imagine that we've simply been given a function of many variables, and we want to minimize that function. And for that, we're going to develop a technique called gradient descent, which can be used to solve such minimization problems. This will come back to the specific function. Then we'll come back to specific function we want to minimize for neural network. So if you've, for an example, if you've worked in physics before, you get these handcraft super complex equations, but and they have like tons of variables. But oftentimes the solution is just to take a step back and rather thinking about all of them in context of all those variables, just do the mathematics. Don't really try to uh, fit in all the variables and their relations and think about everything at the same time. Rather focus on one task at one time. So let's say we're trying to minimize the cost function. This could be any real valued function of many variables, v1, v2, and so on. Note that I've replaced the w and v notation by v to emphasize that this could be any function. We're not specifically thinking in the neural networks context anymore. So we are in general minimizing a function. So to minimize c of v, it helps to imagine c of v as a function of just two variables, say v1 and v2, and we plot C with respect to V1 and V2. So if C was a function of V1 and V2, if V1 has value X, V2 has value Y, and we plot the function. and what we're trying to look is for the global minimum, right, where the function is minimized. And to look for the global minimum, we are just looking for the bottommost point of this graph. And of course, for the function plotted above, you can eyeball the graph and find the minimum. In that sense, I've perhaps shown slightly too simple a function. A general function C may be a little more complicated. It may have more troughs and more crests, but like this gives you a general idea. What we're trying to do is essentially find a global minimum, and it might be not as easy as eyeballing everywhere. So one way of attacking the problem is to use calculus to find the minimum analytically. You would compute derivatives and then try using them to find the places that C is an extreme. With some luck, that might work when C is a function with one or a few variables, but it turns into a nightmare when we have more variables. And for neural networks, we'll often have far more variables. The biggest neural networks have cost function which depends on billions of weights and biases in an extremely complicated way. Using calculus to minimize just won't suffice. So after asserting that we'll gain insight by imagining cost function as the function of two variables, I've turned around twice in two paragraphs and said, hey, but what if it's a function of more than many variables? Sorry about that, but please believe me when I say that it really does help to imagine C as a function of two variables. Yeah, it really does. It gives you a more intuitive image. It just happens that sometimes the picture breaks down in the last two paragraphs we're dealing with such breakdowns. Good thinking about mathematics often involves juggling many intuitive pictures, learning when it's appropriate to use each picture and when it's not. Okay. So like this section is quite lengthy, but we'll finish it up, hopefully. But I might have to take a break in between because uh, I have to go somewhere, but I'll try to finish this up. Okay, so calculus won't work. So this, for analogy, we have an algorithm, and for this we have a beautiful analogy. So what we do is essentially think of the function plot as a value, and if you look at it, it isn't really like too much of a claim to make because this really does look like a valley, and if it's more complex then it would have more structures which would be kind of a valley. So our everyday experience tells us that if we take the ball rolling down the slope of a valley, it will go to the bottom of the valley, and using this idea we are going to find the minimum of the function. So we'll choose a starting point for the ball and then simulate the motion of the ball as it is rolled down to the bottom of the valley. We could do this simulation simply by computing derivatives and perhaps some second order derivatives as well, which would tell us everything about the local shape of the valley and therefore how the ball is being rolled. So based on what I've written, you might suppose that we'll be trying to use the Newton's equations. And actually, we're not taking this analogy quite seriously, but we're just getting a basic algorithm and not like trying to make a physics simulation. So now when we have a ball's eye view of what our simulation is going to be, so rather than going into the physics, and we're going to take a mathematical approach. So let's simply ask ourselves if we declared God for a day and could make up our own laws of physics dictating the ball how it should roll, what laws of motion or laws of could we pick so that the ball always rolled to the bottom of the valley. So this is the task at hand. So to make this a little more precise, we take delta v1 to be the uh, distance the ball moved in the direction v1 and delta v2 to be the distance the ball moved in the direction v2. And when we use the chain rule, we get this, and we take the partial derivative of v1 with respect the cost function with respect to v1 and v2, and we get these functions. Since we want to calculate the change, we get the delta v1 terms as well. Okay, so we're now going to calculate a way of choosing delta v1 and delta v2 so as to make delta c negative. So what a negative value means is the cost function is the slope is negative, right? So the ball is rolling down the valley. To figure out how to make a choice, it helps us to define delta v as like the column vector delta v1 and delta v2, one below another. The transpose just makes it a column vector. They're trying to use this, I believe, because it would be difficult to make column vectors. It would make everything out of formatting. And they also define the gradient of the vectors to be this. So take the gradient vector, and the gradient vector is essentially this, uh, which would again be delta c upon delta v1, and below it this, because it is a transpose. So in a moment we'll rewrite the change delta c in terms of delta v, and the gradient by this, uh, del v, del c. I don't really remember the name of the symbol. Okay, so before getting that, I want to clarify something, that sometimes people get hung up on the gradient when meeting this notation. For the first time, people sometimes wonder how should they think about the symbol. What exactly does this mean? In fact, it's perfectly fine to think gradient C. Okay, it's just a gradient as a single mathematical object. The vector defined above, which happens to be written using two symbols. In this point of view, uh, gradient is just a piece of notational flag waving, telling you, hey, gradient C is a gradient vector. There are more advanced points of view where gradient can be viewed as an independent mathematical entity in its own right, for example, as a differential operator, but we won't need those views. That's good to hear. So, with these definitions, the change in C can be written as the gradient of C times the change in V. So this equation helps us to understand why this is the gradient vector. This relates the change in V to the change in C. So actually if you like divide by del V on both sides, delta V on both sides, you can see delta C upon delta V is the gradient C, which actually if you've studied calculus or even gradients and slopes, you would know that this is actually how we define gradients even in the classical sense of basic calculus. So in particular, we're trying to use. So what we're really exciting about this equation is that it lets us how to choose. It lets us see how to choose delta v so as to make delta c negative. In particular, suppose we choose delta v is say negative eta times delta c gradient of c, where eta is a small positive parameter known as the learning rate. This shows us that delta c is approximately uh, okay. So if this is, they've shown that they've said that the change in the vectors v1, v2 is proportional to the change in gradient with the, and this is the proportionality constant. So if they substitute it here, then you get a positive, now a square which is always positive, and negative times eta, and eta was also positive, so this entire change is negative. So this delta C is always less than equal to 0. So C will always decrease, never increase. If we change V according to the prescription in 10, and we use of course some mathematical constraints, this is exactly the property we wanted. So this is the law of motion of the ball, and this is the law which we are going to follow. So in fact what we're going to do is our vector V is going to a new vector v prime or v dash, which is v minus eta times the gradient of c. So we're going to make small changes in the delta v, or the vectors at hand. So this moves the ball's position v by that amount. And then we'll use this update again and again and again and again till we reach the global minimum, and that is what gradient descent is. So like you start here, you go a bit down, a bit down, a bit down, and you eventually roll down to the bottom. So these two paragraphs just talk about that. So to make gradient descent work correctly, we need to choose the learning rate eta to be small enough. So if you don't take eta to be small enough, and then the approximations won't work, and we might end up with a delta c greater than 0, which obviously would not be good, right? So at the same time, we don't want eta to be too small, since then you'll be taking so tiny steps that practically you won't reach a minimum even after many iterations. So in real life, when we implement this stuff, the learning rate on eta is changed, and there are many ways to change and look at what would be a suitable value. So now that we have an explanation of gradient descent, let's have a look at the entire maths once again. So suppose in particular C is a function of m variables. So your V would also have m variables, transpose obviously because this is a vector, a column. This equation holds as before. The gradient of c is again the derivatives and then a column vector, and the change in v is negative eta times the gradient of c. So this is an equation again from which we've been using from the very start. So we can think of this update rule as defining the gradient descent. This is what we're doing essentially. After each iteration, we're repeatedly changing the position v in order to find the minimum of the function c. The rule doesn't always work, and sometimes you might be stuck at a local minimum at not go at a global minimum. But in practice, this works extremely well. And in neural networks, we'll find that it's a powerful way of minimizing the cost function and so helping the net learn. Indeed, there is a sense in which gradient descent is the optimal strategy for searching for a minimum. Let's suppose that we're trying to make a move delta v in position so as to decrease c as much as possible. So this is equivalent to minimizing delta c is approximately a gradient of c times delta of v. So we'll constrain the size of the move so that delta v is epsilon for some small fixed epsilon greater than 0. In other words, we want to make a move that is a small step of fixed size. We are trying to find a movement direction which decreases c as much as possible. It can be proved that the choice of delta v, which minimizes gradient of c into delta v, is this, where eta is epsilon upon the norm of gradient of c, and is determined by the size constraint delta of v is equal to epsilon, the length of the vector. So gradient descent can be viewed as a way of taking small steps in the direction which does the most to immediately decrease. So if you even didn't get this, like it's no huge deal, but I highly hope you did. Essentially, what they're trying to say is when they mathematically it was analyzed, they found out that uh, the choice of delta v, which minimizes this, is this. So to minimize this gradient of c into delta of v, which is actually delta of c, so we're trying to minimize the change in c. You have to use a learning rate which is epsilon upon the length of the vector which is formed by the gradients. Okay, so there are a couple of exercises as well, and then okay, so this has again a lot of stuff. So I'll probably take a break here, and for the next part we'll continue from these exercises.